Hey guys, how's it going? It's a little drafty in here. It's very weird being bald. I've been having to wear something on my head outside because it's cold out. I'm used to my hair heating me up and it's just totally different feeling. If you missed this, the live stream is still up. You can still go check it out. We raised $300 for US ARC, which I'll be sending over there next month when YouTube sends me the money. I'm really stoked for how it went. I thought we all had a good time. Definitely something I plan to do more so in the future. But you guys are here today because we are doing an Ackie Monitor comprehensive one care guide. So let's get to that. It's been a long time since I've done a comprehensive care guide. I thought it would be a good way to start off 2021. So let's get to it. Enclosure, you can see I have an enclosure right behind me for an adult female Hendrick red Ackie. This is what I house size-wise typically for my Ackie monitors when they're adults. This is 6 by 2.5 feet by 4 feet. I forget what that is in centimeters. I'll plug that up there for you EU people. But that's what I house all my adults in, and I fully recommend it. I think it's a great size. My dream is to always do an 8x4x4 with a trio eventually, but we're not just there yet. Until 8 months, I think you can get away with a 4x2x3, and then when you get to 8 months, I would do nothing less than a 5x2.5x3. Now, what's most important there is the height. There's a lot of things you have to take into account. So let's look at this one right here. This one has substrate up to about here. This is 24 inches at this mark. You guys can't even see what I'm doing. All right, that's better. This is about 24 inches right here when you can start seeing over the PVC. I like to put 20 inches of substrate. We'll talk about that more in the substrate section. But then you also need room for climbing. You can see climbing wood in there probably. And then you need room that separates their back from the UVB. And for UVB, if you're using like a 14%, that's like 15 inches. So if you're looking at doing this yourself, I'm gonna just get down here with you guys. If you look at doing this yourself, you're probably going to need that spacing, and that probably at minimum, you know, is what, 3 feet? You could probably go a little bit less on the substrate, maybe like 18 inches. I recommend not going less than 1.5 feet. I think that's pretty optimal. Barely, if you want to do the bare minimum, that's probably like 1 foot. You would have 1 foot of substrate. Let's say you went with a 12%, which you could get within 1 foot of the back of your monitor. That's 2 feet. And then you need 1 foot of climbing, so at minimum, 3 feet. I totally recommend 4 feet though. That's my thoughts on enclosure size. Now for enclosure material, you see behind me, obviously that's PVC. Those are from Animal Plastics. I say those because I have the same one right over there with another Ackie, a top ender male. I have 2 PVC ones from Animal Plastics. Now these were $8.50 each, I believe. I also have DIY ones. I'm sure you're looking at that right now. Built them myself. I am not very handy, and I still did it myself. They've been going on 3 years now, so they've had some longevity. And you can do them. I have a guide I'll put in the description of how to build your own, just like the ones you're seeing there. And you can go ahead and do it yourself. You don't need to be handy, like I said. And those cost, even with a couple of mistakes, $500, $400 if you do it optimally. So you can save some money doing wood. I would suggest doing maple, looks the best. And it also has all good wood in it. The bad wood might be like pine or cedar or something like that, which could potentially be mixed in with regular plywood, although it's compressed, so it should not be a problem. Just want to give that little cliff note there. But wood, PVC, you could do either, both will work. If you're handy, then all the more power to doing wood yourself or even building PVC yourself. Basically, if you could do it yourself, you're going to save some money, which is great. I think PVC looks great, and if you're not that handy and intimidated by doing a DIY setup, that's a good option to go with, but it's going to cost you a little bit more money. Either way though, both work, both are viable. I have both, built one, bought the other. There you go. Now on the substrate, like I said earlier, I put about 20 inches of substrate into my adult enclosures. Now under 8 months, if you're doing like a 4x2x3, like I said, you could do until 8 months, you probably want about 1 foot. You can maybe get away with like 10 inches, but I like to aim for 1 foot for any of my juveniles in that type of setup. Now, as I was saying, minimum, and I would only do this for males, I would give is 12 inches of substrate, and even with that, I would give some burrowing, I forget what it's called, like a dig box or something like that. I don't know why that didn't come into my head. A dig box, a lay box, something like that, where you could put it in a part of the enclosure that's not close to UVB or something and give them a little bit more to dig in and lay eggs in if you have a female. That is also a very good option, but I would still give 12 inches regardless of whether you have a dig box or not. Dig box would just give an option in the enclosure to have a little bit more substrate. But I like to get close to 2 feet. I aim for about 20 inches. If you go 1.5 feet, which is 18 inches, that is fine, that will be good. This is more important for a female than male because females dig a little extra when laying eggs, and yes, females can lay infertile eggs. They do not have to be in a pair to lay an egg. So I would definitely make sure you have at least 1.5 feet, more closer to 20 inches if you have a female in there. You can also do a gradient. I kind of have that in this enclosure where this side over here is not as deep as this side over here. And while that's important is because you want the higher substrate or the deeper substrate to be on the side of where they're going to lay, and that's going to be near that basking bowl because they're going to be looking for that 86 degrees, some 1 foot down, maybe even more, and they will definitely be looking for exactly that temperature with some humidity mixed in. So it's really important, substrate depth. I think it's very undervalued and not talked too much about with Ackie monitors. I think there's a lot of enclosures that need more than just a couple inches they're being given or whatever. But again, that's my opinion. This is my guide. I'm not going to say it's fact. I definitely recommend checking out other guides and forming your own opinion. But that's my thoughts on substrate. As for substrate mixes, you want something that can retain a burrow and at the same time something that can hold humidity, especially several inches down from the top layer, which will probably be dry mostly overall. But what I do for mixes is I take organic topsoil. I usually use Scott's. I've used other in the past, but more recently I've used Scott's. I take that and I do 2 parts Scott's organic to 1 part play sand, and that's been a pretty standard mix. I know pretty much everybody who I've talked to pretty much does that mix. Sometimes we'll mix in some peat moss or sphagnum moss to up the humidity if they're having issues, but for the standard mix, that's pretty standard. And I get some good burrows, I retain moisture pretty well, but that mix may change up a little bit depending on the environment and the enclosure style you have, but that's the mix I go with. Going up from the substrate, we now reach our climbing layer. I think you can see the female right now climbing right there. It might be too small for you guys, but maybe you see her. Basically, you want to give probably around 1 foot of climbing space. That's what I like to do. You really want to let them do this because they're really semi-arboreal. They love to climb and get into all these antics, explore their enclosure, definitely adds to enrichment. So I like to give at least 1 foot of space where they can climb and more if I can. So I get all my wood because wood can be very expensive if you purchase it from the outdoors. I got a bunch from across the street from my neighbor who was cutting down their maple tree, and I was like, hey, free wood, they're just gonna throw it out. So I went ahead and grabbed it, and I got some crazy looks, but I got free wood, and that's all that matters. So I recommend doing that. I don't do anything fancy for them. I'm just gonna throw this in real quick. I just kind of spray it down, soak it. I'll be doing a video coming up on this, probably Wednesday, where I talk about how I prepare my wood for enclosures. It's really just soaking, wiping off, sometimes putting out in the sun. You really don't have to do too much fancy stuff for these reptiles, or any reptiles really. But that's what you want to aim to do for climbing wood. Maple's a good log. Just research the type of wood that you're getting. Make sure it wasn't from a sketchy area, and you can plug it right in there. Water and food bowls. Let's start with water bowls. I like to offer a water bowl that's at head level or just below head level so they can really kind of just stand there and drink from it and don't have to kind of climb into it. I prefer doing something like that. Altogether though, one that they have to kind of climb in, they'll still sense the water's there, they'll still go ahead and get a drink from it, so I don't think it's a huge difference. Now, Ackies mostly get their moisture through their food, so you're not going to really actively see them drinking. It will be a semi kind of rare occasion, but you will see them using it, so it is really important to maintain a water bowl and make sure it's clean. I clean mine every other day, every 3 days is fine too, most likely. Other than that, I know some people like a deeper water bowl to add humidity to the enclosure. I don't really use my water bowls to supplement humidity in my enclosures, so I don't really go for that type of style of a bowl. But there is nothing wrong with that. For feeding, you can use a food bowl. I used a food bowl for the first year of having Ackies. I tried putting tape around the side to keep dubias in, crickets just hop out. I found it very hard to maintain, so I personally don't like that method. I think the two methods you really should use is tongue feeding and hunting. Tongue feeding is really good for a new Ackie you just got, probably young, but still works with adults, where you can kind of use tongues and food on the other end to lead them onto your arm, get them used to you. Food is a powerful motivator and a positive connection to yourself, so that's a great way to establish a bond and some trust between the two of you. Now, if you have an established guy, I recommend hunting, and that's just kind of tossing in your crickets, your roaches, whatever you're feeding them, into their enclosure for them to find. It's great for physical and mental enrichment, so it only helps them in pretty much all regards, and I think that's what I do pretty much for feeding and water bowls. Now let's talk about the basking spot. You're going to want to design it where there's various gradients and temperatures available to them. I like to have my adult range be something like 135 to 160. The sweet spot is usually in the 140, so if you can at least have 140 to 150 gradient, you're probably good, but the more you can give, the better. A lot of people use a retest stack. That is very popular with monitors, especially dwarf monitors, to give that gradient around the basking spot. So you might have heard of that. That's a great way to do it. I haven't done one yet, but I might do one in the future. But you're going to want to offer some gradient there of different ranges of temperatures. Like I said, I offer 135 to 160 Fahrenheit. For babies, I like to start out around the first couple months. I keep it around 125, and I slowly start adding to it. Around 6 months, I'll probably be at like 135, maybe 130 still, depending on how I feel. And then getting to 145 around probably the 8-month mark, maybe even 10-month mark. So you want to gradually get it up there, starting around probably 125 Fahrenheit if you have a couple month old baby, and then boosting it up every couple months. Onto hides, I recommend having at least 2 hides, one being on the high end and one being on the low end of the enclosure. A good hide to utilize is just something like a big cork round. Not only can they use it as a hide, but they can also climb it, so it knocks out 2 birds with 1 stone. This is a nature channel, so I probably shouldn't use that one, but you get my point. Commercial hides work fine too. I have a mixture of the both, so feel free to do whatever. I would just at least offer 2, one on the low end, one on the high end of the enclosure. Ackie monitors work well in a bioactive setup, and I did want to just talk about what insects, what invertebrates, what isopods specifically work great in their enclosures. Now, I have all my enclosures semi-bioactive. Basically, I have all the bioactive elements but plants, because these guys, they're pretty destructive. And I'm going to look into plants in the future, but for now, we're not there yet. As for the isopods I use to recycle the waste and cycle the substrate, I like to use dwarf whites, which are pretty small, and I've recently been using Grand Canyon isopods. They're a little bit bigger. I've had some of them get eaten by my Ackies, which is not a big deal overall other than losing an isopod, but it does quicken the rate at which that waste is decomposed and gotten rid of. So I really like the Grand Canyon ones. I've been pretty much focusing on them specifically now, not as much the dwarf whites. Both do well in the environment, the temperatures, the humidity, so you shouldn't have any problems there. Springtails haven't had much success, so I don't know if I do them. You can try them out. I'm sure it could have just been a me thing, but that's what I use for bioactive insects, and that's pretty much all we'll talk about bioactive ones. We talked about the basking spot. We didn't talk about ambient temperatures. Now, this is going to change. It's not going to be very strict. I mean, not even the basking spot temperature is very strict. Number one, and I don't personally monitor this, the high temp. I don't really focus on high temperature. It really is the gradient of the basking spot in my enclosure design. So that really ranges from as low as 90 degrees. That's kind of the lowest gradient portion before it really balances out outside of that 135 to 160 range. That's the main gradient. So I would say if I was to give one, maybe in the 90s would be the high temperature, but it's really just the overall gradient of that basking side, which is right there. Now for the low temperature, I do monitor this side. This side usually sits at the high point in the day in the low to mid 80s, especially in the summer months. And then at night, it might go as low as 70, high 60s. Rarely in the 60s though. That's just really for the coldest nights. So that's really where you want to range. Obviously, like I said, the summer months, it tends to average a little bit hotter, while in the winter, it tends to average a little bit lower. I would say in summer, it doesn't dip below 75, maybe even higher, where in the winter, it really doesn't get into the mid 80s that much on the low end. So where does that heat come from? It's gotta come from somewhere. These are the bulbs I use. I get these babies at Lowe's. I'm sure you could order them online too. They're just General Electric, par 38, 80 watt, no, I think they're 90 to 120 watt replacements using only 80 watts. So this halogen floodlight is what I use. I use 2 of them in all my enclosures except my baby ones, and that's because those enclosures are too small to have 2 in there. You don't want the whole thing being a basking spot. 2 of them is especially important though because it helps widen and diversify the gradient. So you do want 2 in an adult enclosure, and again, that's why it's important that your adult enclosure is plenty big enough. So that's the basking bulbs I like to use, and we're going to talk about UVB right now. Arcadia is my main one and only brand for UVB. I think they're by far the top UVB brand you can use out there, but I'm sure there's other ones that are probably just as good. I've just really fallen in love with Arcadia. I mainly use their 14% bulb. 2/3 the length of the enclosure is what you want to aim for, and the 14% you want the Ackie to not get closer than 15 inches to the bulb. You can use 12% if it's a little bit shorter in terms of the height you have in the enclosure. If you use a 3-foot one instead of a 4-foot one, the 12% might be better because you can get as close as a foot instead of 15 inches. That's the main one I use. I also have a reflective fixture, which is great and definitely might add a couple more inches onto the farness away from their back. I also like to use a 6% in front of the 14%. This does not offer too much UVB, but it does help brighten up the enclosure a ton. I'm sure there's ways that can be cheaper that you can use to brighten up the enclosure and such like that, but I personally really like this method, especially if you're already getting Arcadia, so I recommend doing something like that. So clarify, in front, I have 2/3 the length of an enclosure, the 6% with a reflective fixture, then a couple inches back, I have the 14% same length with a reflective fixture. Next we have humidity, and oh boy is this a topic. There is a lot of discussion, debate, and unknowns about humidity with Ackie monitors, but these guys are very hardy. So even if you make a mistake that they don't react super well with their sheds specifically, you can always make changes and fix the issue and then be totally okay. I think what's most important for humidity is definitely the substrate humidity. That's where they're going to be burrowing. That's where they're going to be getting those sheds off by going into the humid, moist substrate. That's number one why substrate depth is super important, because you need that moisture humid gradient in there. And you can't just have a couple inches being able to produce something like a gradient for moisture and humidity. Air humidity still helps. It's still important. Don't downplay that. But especially in their natural ranges, and no, that's not captivity, so there is some differences, it can go into the 40% really. So here in captivity, it's okay for the air humidity to be a little bit lower than probably what you see in a lot of care guides. Mine really fluctuates between 60 and 80%. And it usually is in the 70s. So air humidity, usually in the 70s. I don't measure the substrate humidity, although I've been thinking about putting a probe in there to measure it. But usually as long as the first couple inches are only the inches that are sort of dried out, and then you start getting moisture from then on and getting more and more moisture and humidity in there, you're usually good. You can pretty much tell eventually once you start seeing how they shed and how they react. And each one is different. I've seen some have problems at 70% humidity where I had to boost it up to 80% humidity. I've seen some do well at 60%. There's definitely some leeway there based off of, I guess, genetics. So that's why it's hard to really understand, but that's kind of my understanding of Ackie humidity at this point. Oh, and I guess I should add that I put humidity in by dumping about 2 gallons into these enclosures about every other week, roughly. Sometimes a little quicker, sometimes a little later, depends on season, ambient type of stuff. I just get a 2-gallon watering can and then just fill it up to the top, put some Repti-Safe in there, and just spread it throughout the enclosure. It's enough that it permeates pretty much the entire substrate and not just the top layer, which only spraying down would do. So that's how I add moisture in, and that's how I recommend doing it, but I'm sure there's plenty of other methods that work just as well. Ackies are primarily insectivores, and don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. Yes, in the wild they have been known to occasionally eat other proteins that are not insects, but they're very much more opportunistic in the wild, and we could be much more well-rounded with their diet in captivity. So no, I don't offer the ground turkeys, I don't offer the eggs, I don't offer the pinkies. I focus on only inverts. There's one caveat to that. I do offer a few pinkies that are very heavily dusted to females after they lay eggs to help them recover. That is really the only excuse in my mind. Otherwise, I have a staple 4, I have dubia roaches, I have crickets, I have superworms, and I have grasshoppers. I am in the US, so I cannot have locusts, but grasshoppers work just as well. I like to primarily focus on the dubia roaches, being that they're the healthier option there, and I gut load them all, and I really just focus on those main 4, and they're happy, healthy, lean. I have no problems, and their weight always looks good. So that's what I focus on feeding-wise. Again, this is my opinion though, and I don't think you're going to give harm to your Ackie if you occasionally offer some of the things I said not to offer. So, you know, you make your opinion, look at all the resources out there. Don't let me tell you what to do and what not to do. I've come to realize Ackie feeding schedules can be pretty diverse. A lot of owners do a bunch of different things with these guys, so there's a lot you can't do wrong here. Personally, I feed 3 times a week. I feed Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, and I like to give dubia roach-wise about 6 or 7 1 to 1.25 inch sizes dubia roaches. Crickets, I give about 8 to 10 large. Supers, I give about 3, and then grasshoppers, I give about 6 3/4 of an inch size. Now, as babies, they're gonna eat every day pretty much, since it's important to get that food in them and help them grow. You might want to offer 3 or 4 half an inch size dubia roaches. Primarily, they'll probably focus on their crickets, though. You can offer about probably 4 per Ackie, baby Ackie, each feeding every day. That's the 2 I primarily focus on when they're babies. They love the crickets, like I said, but as they get older, you're going to slow down to about every other day, maybe around like 8 months or something like that, and eventually you can go to 3 times a week or something. That's how I do things though, but I know people who feed every day still as adults. It's really about the content, how much per feeding and such like that. As with many other reptiles, you're going to want to supplement with calcium, no D3. You can add in D3 maybe once every 2 weeks if you really want to. It's not going to do much harm, but if you have adequate UVB, you should be fine. Otherwise, I don't offer a multivitamin or anything like that. I just stick with the calcium. You're pretty golden doing something like that. I use the Zoomed right now, but I'm looking to change because I've read some things about them not being as good as some other products. So how I go about doing that is I usually just take a Tupperware, I then put whatever I'm feeding in it, sprinkle in some of that calcium, swirl it around, dump it in the enclosure, and you're good to go. Very briefly, I just want to give some wise words of warning to not jump into getting a duo or a trio if you're not too experienced with reptiles, specifically monitor lizards. I did that. I ended up having my female lose kind of her pinky finger here and a spout between the 2, especially during sexual maturity. That's just something that happens. You need to know their behaviors, know when maybe one needs to be separated, and you have to have something on standby to put them in case they do need to be separated. So really heed that warning. And if you're not too experienced, don't dive into getting a duo or trio. Start out with 1, see their behaviors, then maybe think about it. And lastly, day-night light cycles. I don't really focus on changing it up per season. I used to. Now I kind of just keep them on 14 hours a day and then turn the light and heat off for 10 hours. I do that year round and it's worked well for me thus far. So that wraps up our third Comprehensive Ackie Monitor Care Guide. Let's get to a couple announcements. Shout out to our two newest Patreon members, Ellen M and Hex. I really appreciate your support. I also appreciate Stephanie S, Cat and Rick, Darian J, Smooth Cat, Herb M, David T, Angela L. I really appreciate your support. You guys too can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. Check the top right for more information. Tier 3 gets you on my forehead. Well, what's left of it? Use code Professor Herp for $5 off your first purchase of Reptile links at checkout. You can also click the link below in the description that will automatically apply the code for you. Reptile links is a great source of nutrition for your hognose snakes, your tegus, your blue-tongued skinks, and more. I use it as the main diet for Frap, my tegu. I highly recommend them. Again, code Professor Herp at checkout. Check out the merch that's to the left of my head, right of your screen. We have 4 different designs. There's a Teespring link in the description where you can go check those out. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you took something away from this care guide, and I'll see you in the next video. See you guys.